At the Cradle of Monsters, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices, not with AI slop. Real storytelling that makes you feel something a machine never could. My name is Rena. Let's begin. The Miranai had built their entire civilization around silence, not the absence of sound. Their cities hummed with wind chimes strung between coral towers. Their oceans sang with the low pulse of migrating leviathans. Their children laughed in the shallow tide pools every evening until the twin moons rose. But the absence of violence. For 11,000 years, no Miranai had raised a hand against another living thing, and it was not law that kept it that way. It was memory. Somewhere in the deep archives beneath the coral spire were records of the one war the Miranai had ever fought, so long ago that the words for the weapons used in it no longer existed in any spoken dialect. The species had looked at what they'd done to each other and decided, as one, never again. They had kept that promise for 400 generations. They had no armies. They had no soldiers. They had never needed them because the last soldier had died before recorded memory began, and no Miranai alive had ever been trained to hold a weapon, let alone use one. Speaker of Tides Neremeth stood on the observation deck of the coral spire and watched 3 moons' worth of unfamiliar light bloom across the night sky, where no light should have been. She was old, even by the long-lived standards of her people. Her outer membrane had faded to the pale, translucent gray that marked the very eldest speakers, and her wing fins had not carried her more than a few meters above the water in over a decade. But her mind was sharp, and both of her hearts were beating hard enough that she could feel them. "How many?" she asked. Her voice membrane fluttered, betraying her. A speaker's calm was supposed to be absolute. Hers was cracking, and she knew it, and she let it crack anyway because there was no one left to perform composure for. 400 vessels confirmed, speaker. Perhaps more behind the debris field. The voice belonged to Halvorn, keeper of the outer sensors, a young Miranai who had spent his whole short life cataloging the migratory patterns of leviathans and had never once needed to sound afraid until tonight. They're not slowing down, they're not even decelerating for atmospheric entry. They don't need to. 400 ships. The Miranai Concord owned 19 vessels in total, and every single one of them had been built to ferry grain and coral silk between the floating settlements. None of them had a single weapon mounted anywhere on their hulls. It had never occurred to anyone in 11,000 years that they might need one. The Skarn Dominion had arrived. Every civilization in the settled galaxy knew the stories, the way children everywhere know the shape of the monster under the bed, even if they've never seen it themselves. The Skarn didn't ask. They didn't trade. They didn't negotiate terms or offer surrender conditions that meant anything. They came, they took whatever had value, and they burned whatever didn't, so that no one else could ever have it either. 23 civilizations had gone dark under Skarn banners in the last 600 years. 23 languages had simply stopped being spoken by anyone still breathing to speak them. "They've made contact," Halvorn said, and something clicked wetly in his throat, the Miranai equivalent of a swallowed sob. Their fleet commander's message came through an hour ago, text and audio both, translated automatically before we even had a chance to refuse it. He said we have 2 options: kneel and serve, or resist and be cleared from the board. Neremeth closed both sets of eyelids, slow and deliberate. Around her on the wide coral terrace, the other speakers sat in silence. Some of them wept, their membranes trembling with a grief too large to voice. A few pressed their palms together and murmured old invocations to gods the Miranai had stopped believing in centuries before any of them were born, because there was nothing else left to do with their hands. None of them spoke, because there was nothing shaped like an answer to offer. The coral spire shuddered, not from wind, not from tide, but from something detonating in the water half a kilometer away. Through the observation glass, Neremeth watched one of the outer reef cities tear loose from its floating platform and begin to sink, trailing fire and black smoke across the water's surface like a wound that wouldn't close. 40,000 people had lived on that platform: teachers, fishmongers, silk weavers, children who had never in their lives seen a weapon fired in anger, and never would again because they would not live long enough to see anything else. The Miranai had spent 11,000 years believing that peace was a thing you could simply choose, permanently, and have it hold forever, that kindness compounded like interest and eventually made you safe. Tonight, watching a city drown in fire, Nerimeth understood for the first time in her very long life that they had been wrong, and that the wrongness had always been there. Patient, waiting for a night exactly like this one. Speaker. A younger voice, small and steady despite everything. Ilith, the newest and least senior member of the council, barely old enough to have earned her speaker's mantle. There may be something we haven't tried. Ilith produced a small case from beneath her robes. It was tarnished with age, its surface etched in symbols that no living Miranai could translate, and yet every Miranai on the terrace recognized it immediately, the way you recognize the shape of a story you were told as a child and never wanted to believe was real. No. Halvern's voice came sharp and fast, fear making it louder than he intended. The compact was explicit when they gave us that thing, absolute desperation only when every other avenue of hope has been exhausted completely. We are not there yet. Look outside, Halvern. Elith's voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver either. Our cities are sinking into the sea we've lived beside for 11,000 years. Our people are dying in water that used to be safe. If this isn't absolute desperation, I would very much like to know what you imagine would satisfy the definition. You don't understand what you're asking for, Halvorn said. Do you know who answers that beacon? Do you have any idea what kind of thing is going to come? I know the stories, Elith said quietly. Everyone knows the stories. Nerimeth reached out and took the case from Ilith's four-fingered hands. It was heavier than it looked, the way certain decisions always are. Heavier than its actual mass, weighted with everything it might set in motion. The Interstellar Compact had given the Miranai this beacon 400 years earlier, along with a warning delivered in the careful, formal language diplomats use when they're afraid of what they're describing. It would summon aid. But the aid it summoned would come from a species the Compact had quarantined behind a border that no other member species was permitted to cross in either direction. A species so unpredictable, so thoroughly unwinnable to fight, that every civilization that had ever tried containing them through war had eventually settled for containing them through treaty instead, because it was cheaper than losing. The humans. Almost no living being outside their sealed sector had ever actually met one. They had been given 400 star systems and a single non-negotiable condition in exchange. Stay inside the line, indefinitely, forever. The single exception carved into that treaty, the one loophole the Compact's founders had argued over for a full generation before finally agreeing to it, was this. If any member species of the Compact activated an emergency beacon, and only then, humanity was permitted to cross the border and respond. They say the humans are worse than the Skarn, Halvern whispered, and for the first time that night his voice sounded less like fear and more like grief. They say there's nothing worse than the Skarn, and the humans are worse than that. They say a great many things, Nerimeth answered. She looked down at the case in her hands, then out at her burning world, at the smoke rising black against moonlight, at the shape of a city she had loved for 140 years disappearing beneath the waves. What choice do we actually have left, Halvern? We can die with certainty tonight, or we can gamble on uncertainty and possibly die tomorrow instead, having tried something. Perhaps the humans are monsters. Perhaps they are worse than anything that has ever come for us, but perhaps, only perhaps, they are something else entirely. And we will never know unless we ask. She pressed the release. For a long moment, nothing happened. The device grew warm in her palms, and a soft light pulsed once beneath its etched surface, faint and blue. Then the light faded, and the case went cold and inert, as if it had never held anything at all. It's done, Nerimeth said. Now we wait. How long? Ilith asked. I don't know. Hours, days. Perhaps they won't come at all, and we'll have spent our last hope on nothing. Nerimeth set the case down on the terrace and turned back to the window. Below, Skarn landing craft were already touching down along the coastline, disgorging ground troops onto beaches that had never known footprints heavier than a child's. Soon, there would be a ground war, and the Miranai, who had never held a weapon, never trained for violence, never even properly imagined what it looked like up close, would be swept aside like foam on the tide. "Speaker," Halvorn said softly. "What have you done?" Naramith did not answer. She watched her world burn and wondered whether she had just saved her people, or handed them to something worse than what was already killing them. Far across the galaxy, in a sealed, dark region of space that most civilizations had quietly agreed, by unspoken and universal consensus, to stop thinking about entirely, a signal arrived. Alarms began to sound in installations that had been silent for years. Somewhere deep inside that dark sector, engines that hadn't fired in a long time began, slowly, to warm. 2. Fleet Commander Draith Osuan stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched a civilization burn beneath him with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a familiar sunset. The fires spread across the coastline in blooming patterns, painting the smoke above them in shades of orange and ash-gray. Another easy conquest. Osuan had led Skarn war fleets for 31 years, and in that time he had brought 14 worlds fully under Dominion control. The Miranai would be his 15th. "Ground forces have secured both coastal capitals," reported Cressa, his second-in-command, a scarred veteran with a voice like gravel shifting. "Resistance is essentially non-existent, Commander. These creatures don't seem to understand they're supposed to fight back." "Of course they don't," Osun said. "They're prey. They've always been prey. They simply didn't know it until tonight." The bridge crew laughed at that, a harsh, grinding sound like stone against stone. The Skarn didn't laugh often, but they enjoyed the sound of a weaker species' certainty finally breaking. It reminded them of their own strength, and reminders were always welcome. "How long until full occupation?" 2 days, perhaps 3, Cressa answered. "Their underground shelters are better built than we expected, but they won't hold. Once we break through, whatever's left will surrender or die." "Good." Osun settled back into his command chair, already bored with the details of a victory that had never been in any real doubt. "Wake me if something interesting happens." The bridge fell into a familiar, comfortable rhythm. Officers monitored their stations, tracking the crawl of ground forces and the steady rain of orbital bombardment. Everything proceeded according to plan. Everything was, in the specific and unremarkable way that the 14th conquest of a career tends to feel, entirely routine. Then Officer Tam spoke up. Tam was different from the rest of the bridge crew, smaller, leaner, his scales a lighter shade of gray-green than was typical, and he had earned his post not through combat strength, but through a mind that noticed patterns other officers preferred to ignore. He had a habit of asking questions that made people uncomfortable, which was not a habit the Skarn Dominion particularly rewarded, but he was good enough at his job that no one had found a clean excuse to remove him yet. "Commander," Tam said, "our sensors picked up an unusual transmission approximately 1 hour ago. Very brief. Extraordinarily high energy for its duration. It originated from the planet's surface and was directed outward, toward the far dark sector." Osuan opened one eye. "Unusual how?" "The signal's destination is what concerns me. It was aimed directly at a region designated in the old compact charts as the human quarantine zone." The bridge went quiet in a way it had not gone quiet in years. "A distress call to nowhere," Cressa said, "a beat too fast, a beat too loud. The prey is crying for help. Let them cry. No one answers a call sent into an empty sector." "Perhaps," Tam said. "But the targeting was too precise to be random hope. Whoever sent it knew exactly where they were aiming, and knew it was worth the risk of aiming there at all. Superstition." Cressa's voice carried an edge that hadn't been there a moment before, the particular sharpness of someone trying to convince himself as much as anyone listening. "The humans are a story the Compact tells its member species to frighten them into obedience. No one has seen one in 3 centuries. They don't exist anymore, if they ever did." "They exist," Tam said quietly. "The Compact has maintained an active quarantine border for over 400 years. You don't spend 4 centuries guarding an empty room, Commander. Then they're prisoners," Cressa said. Weak things locked away for the safety of everyone else. If they were genuinely dangerous, why would any species agree to be caged? Tam tilted his head, an unhurried gesture. Do you know the actual history of how that quarantine came to exist, Commander? Osun said nothing, which Tam took as permission. I've studied the old records, the ones from before the border was drawn. The humans weren't defeated into that agreement. They weren't threatened or starved into submission. They were offered it. The compact gave them 400 systems and told them they could do whatever they wanted inside those borders indefinitely, provided they never crossed the line. And the humans said yes. He paused. Do you know why? No one answered. Because they were bored, Tam said. According to the records, they had already run out of things to fight on their own world by the time they reached space. They'd conquered every hostile environment their planet could offer, hunted down every predator large enough to threaten them, tamed every creature that could be tamed. When they finally left their atmosphere and started meeting other species, most of what they found in the early records is this: humans fighting each other, constantly, for reasons that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with ideas. The compact's offer gave them somewhere to spread out that wasn't already occupied by anyone they'd have to share it with. Room to keep fighting each other without accidentally involving the rest of the galaxy. You speak as if you admire them, Osun said. I speak as someone who's read the file, Commander, and found it difficult to stop reading. Tam's claws tapped once against his console, an unconscious habit. Their homeworld was a nightmare by any reasonable ecological standard. Extreme temperature swings, toxic native flora, ground that shakes and splits without warning, a sun that bombards the surface with radiation strong enough to damage unprotected tissue in under an hour. Most species that evolve on worlds like that develop one strategy: hide. Get small, get fast, get underground, avoid. Humans evolved the opposite strategy. They evolved to chase. No natural armor, no venom, no claws worth mentioning, nothing built for a single decisive strike. What they have instead is endurance. On their homeworld, before they built a single city, they hunted by pursuit, tracking a wounded animal for hours, sometimes days, across any terrain, in any weather, until the animal simply couldn't run anymore and gave up. They call themselves, in their own old records, persistence predators. They don't need to be faster than what they're chasing. They only need to never, ever stop. Cressa shifted in his seat, uneasy despite himself. These are stories, officer. These are recorded facts filed by the Compact's own first contact delegation, Tam said. And it gets stranger. Humans domesticated apex predators from their own world, animals with teeth built for killing, and turned them into companions that sleep in their homes. They mastered the controlled use of fire before most of their own scientific disciplines existed. They ingest mild neurotoxins for recreation and call the practice a pleasant evening. They routinely survive injuries that would be fatal to nearly any other known species, and they consider this an unremarkable fact about themselves rather than something extraordinary. The bridge had gone very quiet. When the Compact's first delegation made formal contact, Tam continued, the humans were, at that exact moment, engaged in what their own records call a world war, killing one another by the millions, with weapons capable of leveling entire cities, over disagreements about ideology and resource allocation between groups of their own species. The delegation withdrew within a single day of arrival and recommended permanent quarantine before they'd even finished their formal assessment report. Why are you telling us this now? Osun said. It wasn't quite a question. Because if the Miranai's signal reached that sector, Commander, the humans may respond. And if they respond, I believe we should already understand what we're facing, rather than discovering it during the engagement. Cressa laughed, but the sound came out hollow, unconvincing even to himself. We are the Skarn Dominion. We have brought 14 civilizations to heal. What could these prey animals, possibly do that we cannot handle? Tam looked at him with something that might, on a different species' face, have been read as pity. There's an old saying among the Compact's founding races, Commander. They say the Skarn are the monster the galaxy fears. But the humans are the monster the monsters fear. Austin rose from his chair and walked to the viewport. Below him, the Miranai world continued to burn, his fleet arranged around it like a net woven from steel and fire. 600 ships, crewed by warriors who had never once tasted defeat in living memory. "I don't believe in ghost stories," he said. "I believe in force, and we currently possess more of it than anything else in this system." He turned back to his crew. "Continue the assault. If the humans do come, we will show them exactly what a real monster looks like." But as he spoke, Austin noticed his own hand trembling faintly at his side. He folded it behind his back before anyone could see, and hoped, for the first time in 31 years, that no one had. 3 days after the beacon activated, Speaker Narameth had stopped counting the dead. The numbers had grown too large, too abstract, too impossible to hold inside a single mind without breaking something essential in it. She sat now in a flooded understructure beneath what had once been her capital, surrounded by the surviving members of her council, and perhaps 60 civilians they had managed to pull from the wreckage before the tide came in. The chamber was cold and dim, lit only by emergency panels that flickered and buzzed on failing power. Fresh water was nearly gone. What food remained had been rationed down to almost nothing. Above them, through meters of rock and coral, the muffled thud of Skarn ground patrol searching for survivors could be felt more than heard, a slow, heavy rhythm like something enormous breathing. "The beacon failed," Halvorn said. He sat folded into a corner, wing fins pressed tight against his body, and had not moved in hours. "No one is coming. We are going to die in this room." Narameth did not answer. She had run out of words to offer 3 days ago. She had spent every hour since hoping and watching and hoping again, and now she felt only a vast, quiet emptiness where hope used to sit. Perhaps Halvorn was right. Perhaps no one was coming. Perhaps the humans had received the signal and simply chosen, for reasons that would never be explained to a dying species on a dying world, not to answer it. Perhaps they weren't real at all. Perhaps they had only ever been a story the Compact told its member species to make the dark feel a little less absolute. A young communications officer burst into the chamber breathless. Her name was Senate, barely more than a juvenile, and she had been crying steadily for most of the last 2 days. But now her eyes were wide with something else entirely. "Speaker," she gasped, "the backup deep array sensors. They're picking something up." Narameth looked up slowly. "Picking up what, child?" "Ships. Many ships. Entering the system from fold space transition." "More Skarn," Halvorn said bitterly, without opening his eyes. "No." Senate's voice trembled. "The energy signatures don't match anything in our database. They're arriving from the direction of the quarantine border." Narameth stood so fast her old joints ached in protest and did not care. She pushed past the others and followed Senate down the flooded corridor to the communications room, where a single working screen showed what was unfolding in high orbit above what remained of her world. She stopped. She stared. For several seconds, she genuinely forgot to breathe. Ships were pouring out of fold space above the planet. Not one, not a dozen, but hundreds, emerging in tight, disciplined formation, hulls dark and sharply angular, weapons already glowing with stored power before they'd even finished translating into real space. They were not beautiful ships. There was no grace built into their design, no elegance, nothing decorative. They looked like they had been built for exactly one purpose and had never once been asked to serve any other. "How many?" Narameth whispered. 200 confirmed, Speaker. Possibly more. They're still arriving. 200 ships against 600 Skarn vessels. Those were terrible odds by any reasonable measure. But the Miranai had nothing at all, and any ally at those odds was infinitely better than the alternative. "Are they attempting communication?" Narameth asked. "Broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously, Speaker. Open channel. They want everyone in the system to hear it." A voice filled the small chamber. Female, calm, unhurried. Speaking a language the automatic translators worked hard to render, but couldn't quite soften around the edges, as if there were something underneath the words that resisted translation entirely. "This is Commodore Renata Cruz, Terran Response Fleet. We received your emergency beacon 3 days ago. Apologies for the delay. Some of these ships hadn't left dock in a while and needed waking up properly. We're here to help. Please remain in shelter and keep low. Things are about to get considerably loud. Naramith felt tears forming behind both sets of eyelids and could not have said whether they came from relief or fear or something with no clean name in her language at all. The humans were real. The humans had come. But what exactly had she just invited onto her dying world? Ifi. On the Skarn flagship, Osun stood before the main viewport and watched the human fleet arrive with his scales gone visibly pale, a Skarn stress response he had never once needed to hide from his own crew before this exact moment. Impossible, he breathed. How did they cross that distance so quickly? Fold space engines, Tam said quietly. There was something in his voice that sounded almost unmistakably like quiet satisfaction. They've had 300 years of enforced isolation and nothing else to occupy that time except improving their own technology. Sir, the communications officer looked up from her station. The human flagship is hailing us directly. Put them through. The view screen flickered and resolved, and Osuin saw a human for the first time in his life. Commodore Renata Cruz was small, impossibly, almost comically small for someone commanding 200 warships. Soft brown-toned skin, dark hair pulled back tight, eyes calm and level as she sat in her command chair with the unbothered posture of someone handling a routine supply run rather than facing down 600 enemy vessels. "Commander," she said. Her voice was polite, almost friendly. "I understand you're currently attacking a species that asked us for help. I'm going to need you to stop doing that." Osun bared his teeth, a threat display that had made countless enemies across 14 conquered worlds visibly flinch. "You are outnumbered 3-1, human. Your demands mean nothing here." Cruz smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a slight curve of her mouth, and something about it made Osuin's blood run several degrees colder than it had any right to. "Commander, I need you to understand something clearly. We didn't bring 200 ships because we needed 200 ships to handle this. We brought 200 ships because that's how many crews volunteered when the call came in, and we didn't have the heart to turn the rest away." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm going to give you exactly one chance. Withdraw your fleet from this system, and don't come back. Do that, and everyone currently alive gets to stay that way. Refuse." She paused, unhurried. "And let's just say my people have been waiting a long time for a reason to stretch their legs." "You think you can threaten me?" Osun's hands had begun trembling again, and this time he didn't bother hiding it. "I am fleet commander of the Skarn Dominion War Fleet. I have brought 14 civilizations to submission. I have crushed species with more military capacity than yours will ever possess." "I know," Cruz said. "I read your file on the way here. Impressive resume by any objective measure." Her smile widened, just slightly. "But here's the thing, Commander. Every single one of those 14 worlds was full of people who'd already forgotten what violence looked like if they ever knew it all. You've spent your whole career hunting things that couldn't hunt back." Her expression didn't change at all as she added quietly, "We never forgot how." She cut the channel. For a long moment, the Skarn bridge sat in absolute silence. Then Cressa found his voice. "Commander, should we—" The first salvo hit before he finished the sentence. 200 human vessels fired as a single coordinated weapon, targeting solved and executed with a precision that made Skarn tactical doctrine look like guesswork by comparison. 6 Skarn battlecruisers died in the opening 11 seconds, shields overwhelmed, hulls breached, crews gone before their own damage control systems had finished registering the strike. Osuin staggered backward as alarms began screaming across every station. Through the viewport he watched his fleet, his enormous unbeaten fleet, begin to burn. "Return fire!" he roared. "All ships return fire immediately!" Hundreds of Skarn weapons blazed to life at once, filling the space between the fleets with lethal energy. But the human ships were already moving, scattering, regrouping, weaving through the barrage with a fluidity that looked less like combat maneuvering and more like something had already calculated exactly where every incoming shot would land 3 seconds before it was fired. "How are they this fast?" Cressa shouted. "How are they targeting us with this kind of accuracy?" Tam stood rigid at his station, eyes locked on his instruments, his face draining of what little color it had. "They're not simply engaging us, Commander. They're isolating damaged vessels, prioritizing weakened ships. This isn't a battle to them." He looked up. "This is a hunt." Through the viewport, the sky burned with the light of dying ships, and for the first time in a 31-year career built entirely on being the thing that other species feared, Fleet Commander Draith Awson understood with total and sudden clarity exactly what it felt like to be prey. Observer Calith had been a marine biologist before the invasion, spending her days cataloging bioluminescent coral formations and the migratory songs of leviathans in the shallow reefs off the capital. She had never seen violence. She had never once needed to imagine it in any detail. Now she crouched in the ruins of her own flooded laboratory, watching monsters fight monsters in the streets above the waterline. The human dropships had come down like meteors, burning through atmosphere and slamming into the shoreline near Skarn positions with an impact that shook the whole coastline. Calith had expected the humans to establish defensive lines afterward, dig in, build cover, wait for the enemy to come to them, the way any reasonable species facing a numerically superior force would behave. They did not do that. They came out of their landing craft running, not away from the Skarn positions but directly toward them. Calith had attached herself at a careful distance to a squad of human soldiers, Marines they called themselves, who had allowed her to follow after she'd explained, haltingly, through a translation unit, that she wanted to document what happened for her people. They'd said the galaxy should know. She understood now exactly why. The squad's leader was a woman named Sergeant Reyes, small even for a human, barely reaching Calith's shoulder, with a weapon nearly as long as she was tall, and a way of moving through the ruined streets like she'd been born to them. "Contact left," one of her soldiers called out. "4 Skarn moving through the plaza." Reyes raised one hand and the squad simply stopped, still, unhurried. They didn't hide. They didn't retreat. The Skarn came around the corner and saw them, huge, 3 times the height of any human, scales catching the firelight, claws long enough to gouge grooves into stone. They roared and charged. What happened next took less than 10 seconds. The humans fired together, their weapons producing sharp, cracking reports that echoed off the buildings around them. 2 Skarn fell instantly. Armor burned through clean. The third closed the distance and swung a massive claw at Reyes's head. She ducked under the blow, stepped inside his reach, and pressed her weapon against his chest before firing 3 times. He fell. The 4th turned to run. "Martinez," Reyes said, without raising her voice. "Yours." A young man with a quiet half-smile raised his weapon, tracked the fleeing Skarn, already 50 meters distant and accelerating, and fired once. The Skarn stumbled. He fired again. It didn't get up. "Clear," Martinez said. "That was almost too easy." "Don't get comfortable," Reyes replied. "Plenty more where those came from." Calith stared at the bodies in the plaza. 4 Skarn warriors, the same species that had conquered 14 civilizations, that had burned her world and killed thousands of her people in a single night, dead within seconds. "How?" she whispered. "How did you do that so easily?" Reyes looked at her with flat, strange, calm eyes. "Practice," she said simply. "A lot of practice." They moved deeper into the ruined city together. The sounds of battle were everywhere now. Explosions, distant screaming, the sharp percussive crack of human weapons fire. Calith saw things that night she understood she would never fully stop seeing. She watched a soldier take a plasma bolt directly to the shoulder, a wound that blackened and smoked, that should by any measure have ended him. Instead, he pulled a small device from his belt, pressed it against the wound, and activated it. There was a hiss, a sharp smell of burnt tissue, and he grunted once, then simply stood back up and kept moving. "Sarge," he called out. Gonna need a new jacket after this." The others laughed. They laughed as though being shot were a minor inconvenience worth a joke rather than a catastrophe. She watched another soldier, a woman even smaller than Reyes, corner a Skarn warrior in an alley twice her height and 3 times her mass. When her weapon jammed, she didn't retreat and didn't call for help. She threw the weapon down, drew a blade from her belt, and simply closed the distance. Kaleth covered her eyes and listened to the sounds that followed. Growls, a short scream, a wet sound she had no name for and never wanted one. When it stopped, the soldier was standing over the Skarn's body, breathing hard, covered in green blood that wasn't hers, a shallow cut open along one arm. "Tough bastard," she said, and wiped the blade clean on her trousers before rejoining the group. But the part that would stay with Kaleth longest, that would surface in her memory unbidden for the rest of her life, was what happened once the Skarn began to run. Word had already spread through Skarn ranks that the humans weren't a normal enemy. They didn't fight the way civilized forces fought. No organized lines, no acknowledgement of surrender terms, no rules anyone recognized. They hunted, they tracked, and they never, under any circumstance, stopped. Kaleth watched a group of Skarn soldiers break from a collapsing building and flee, throwing down weapons, running as fast as their considerable legs could carry them, faster than any human could ever hope to match. Surely, she thought, they would escape. The humans didn't chase them immediately. They simply watched, tracking the fleeing shapes with their eyes, noting direction and terrain. "Persistence protocol authorized," a voice announced over the comm system. Commodore Cruz speaking from orbit, calm as ever. "All ground units, you're cleared for extended pursuit. Show them what we are." Reyes smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "You heard the Commodore," she said. "Let's go for a jog." The humans began to run. Not fast, not by Skarn standards, but steady, unbroken, metronomic. Kaleth followed as long as her own legs allowed, until her chest burned and her legs gave out and she collapsed against a half-standing wall, watching the humans recede into the smoke-hazed distance, still running, still tracking, still coming. She learned the rest later secondhand. The Skarn soldiers ran nearly 9 kilometers before their bodies simply failed them, built, like all Skarn, for short, violent bursts rather than sustained effort. When they slowed, the humans closed the gap. When they found some final reserve and sprinted again, the humans fell briefly behind, then closed the gap once more, patient as tide. This continued for hours. By the end, the Skarn were crawling. Some wept openly. They begged for it to stop, for rest, for death, for anything at all that would end the pursuit. The humans gave them one choice: surrender or keep running. Every one of them surrendered. 6. 3 days after the human fleet's arrival, it was over. The Skarn warfleet, 600 strong at its height, had been reduced to fewer than 100 surviving vessels, most of them limping toward the system's edge, too damaged to fight and too afraid to leave without orders. On the ground, the last organized Skarn resistance had been captured or eliminated. Survivors sat now in hastily constructed camps, guarded by human soldiers who watched them with calm, patient, unhurried eyes. They were not tortured, they were not abused. They were simply watched and waited over, and somehow that quiet patience felt worse than cruelty would have. Osun himself had been captured on the 2nd day, his flagship disabled by a precision strike that had taken out its engines without breaching the hull. A human boarding party cut through and fought their way to the bridge, killing those who resisted and stunning those who didn't. When they reached him, he had drawn his blade, prepared for a final stand befitting a fleet commander of the Skarn Dominion. The Marine who found him, a scarred veteran with gray hair and tired, patient eyes, looked at him for a long moment. Then he holstered his own weapon and sat down on a piece of wreckage. "You done?" he asked. Osun didn't understand the question. "You can keep fighting if you want," the Marine said. "We'll win either way. You'll just make us work harder for it. Or you can put that down and come talk to the Commodore. Up to you." "You'll execute me," Osun said. It wasn't a question. It was simply what he would have done, in the same position, without hesitation. The Marine shrugged. "Probably not. She wants to talk to you first. After that, another shrug. Above my pay grade, Ocean surrendered. He never fully understood why. Perhaps he was tired. Perhaps some small, unfamiliar part of him wanted to understand exactly how everything had gone so completely wrong, so fast. Now he stood in restraints on the bridge of the human flagship, facing Commodore Cruz directly for the first time. She was smaller in person than she'd appeared on the view screen. Her dark hair streaked with gray he hadn't noticed before, lines around her eyes that spoke of long years and harder decisions than any single conversation could account for. She sat in her command chair with a cup of something warm cradled in both hands, studying him with an expression he found he could not read at all. "Commander Draith Osuun," she said. "Fleet commander of the Skarn Dominion, conqueror of 14 worlds." She paused. "Butcher of 23 civilizations, if we're being precise about the historical record." He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. "I've been reading your file," she continued. "You've killed a great many people, Commander. Billions, by conservative estimate. Most of them civilians. Most of them completely defenseless." "I am Skarn," he said. "We take what we want. It is simply our nature." "Funny thing about nature," Cruz said, taking a slow sip from her cup. "It can change." She rose and walked toward him, stopping just outside arm's reach. Even in restraints, even thoroughly defeated, Osun still towered over her. He could have crushed her skull with a single blow, and something in her eyes held him perfectly still regardless. "You're wondering why you're still alive," she said. "You expected execution. It's what your people would do, in the reverse position. It's what any reasonably cautious species would do to a threat like yours." "Yes," he admitted. "Here's the truth of it, Commander." Her voice stayed calm, almost gentle. "We could exterminate the Skarn Dominion entirely. We've done the calculations. 30 years, perhaps 40, and your species stops being a threat to anyone, permanently. Some of my own officers argued that it was the only responsible course, the only way to guarantee you'd never do this to anyone else again." Osun felt something in his chest go cold in a way 31 years of combat had never once managed. He had known, in the abstract, distant way one knows about weather on a world one has never visited, that humans were dangerous. Hearing it stated this plainly, this casually, made the danger suddenly, uncomfortably real. "But that isn't who we are," Cruz said. "Not anymore." She reached up and touched the restraints at his wrists. For a moment he thought she meant to tighten them. Instead she pressed a release and they fell away entirely. He stared at her, uncomprehending. "We evolved as monsters, Commander," she said, stepping back to her chair. "Persistence predators. Endurance hunters. We're very, very good at killing things, and we spent most of our history proving that fact over and over, first to ourselves and then to anyone unfortunate enough to cross us. But somewhere along the way we learned something else. Took us longer than it should have, probably. We made more mistakes than any species should be allowed and still survive itself. But we learned it, and we've never forgotten it since." "What did you learn?" Osun asked. "Mercy is a choice," Cruz said. "And it's a choice only the strong get to make. The weak can't afford it, they're too busy surviving to spend anything on kindness. But the strong, the genuinely strong, can choose to spare an enemy, can choose kindness over cruelty when cruelty would cost them nothing, can choose to build something instead of simply burning it down because they're capable of doing so." She met his eyes directly. "We're strong enough to end your entire species, Commander, and we're choosing not to." Osun stood very still. In all his years of conquest across 14 worlds, no one had ever spoken to him this way, had ever offered him mercy and framed it correctly, as an act of strength rather than weakness. "Go home," Cruz said. "Take what's left of your fleet and return to Dominion space. Tell them exactly what happened here. Tell them the humans could have ended you completely and chose not to. And tell them that if the Skarn ever threaten another peaceful species again, we won't be quite this philosophical about the decision next time." She smiled, and there was something in it more unsettling than any weapon he'd faced that week. "We're very patient people, Commander. We can wait a long time for you to make the wrong choice again." 7th. Ocean left the human flagship 3 hours later. His remaining ships limped out of the system, battered and reduced, carrying survivors who would never speak of what they'd witnessed without their voices changing. The human fleet stayed in orbit above the Miranai homeworld for weeks afterward, helping rebuild the coastal cities, distributing supplies, treating the wounded. They asked for nothing in return and seemed genuinely confused whenever anyone offered to pay some kind of debt. Speaker Nerameth held a ceremony in the ruins of her capital before the human fleet finally departed. Standing before Commodore Cruz, surrounded by the surviving members of her council and the human soldiers who had saved what remained of her world. "Commodore," she said, "I have to ask you something. Why did you come? We were strangers to you. You had never met us, never traded with us, never owed us anything at all. Why answer our beacon?" Cruz was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the rebuilding city, at Miranai children watching human soldiers hand out food and medical supplies with wide, cautious eyes, slowly softening into curiosity. She looked at the sky, where the smoke had finally, after weeks, begun to clear. "Chancellor," she said at last, the honorific slipping from an old habit, close enough to the meaning that Nerameth let it pass. "We spent a very long time being the scariest thing on our own homeworld. Then we spent an even longer time being the scariest thing in our little sealed corner of the galaxy. Do you have any idea how lonely that actually is? Every single species we ever encountered either ran from us immediately or spent every resource they had trying to lock us safely away where we couldn't hurt anyone." She turned to face Nerameth directly. "Your beacon wasn't just an emergency signal to us. It was the first time in 400 years that anyone in this entire galaxy asked us for help, instead of asking us to please quietly stay away. Do you understand what that meant to us? To finally be needed instead of just feared." Nerameth studied the small, soft-featured creature standing in front of her, this being who commanded death fleets and hunted monsters across the stars with calm, unhurried patience. She had expected, when the beacon first activated, to eventually meet a predator. Instead, she found something else entirely underneath it: hope, and an old, deep loneliness, and a desperate, ancient need to be seen as something more than simply a weapon other people kept locked in a drawer for emergencies. "Perhaps," Nerameth said slowly, "it is time the rest of the galaxy stopped telling stories about your people, Commodore, and started listening to you instead." Cruz smiled. A real smile this time, warm in a way the small, dangerous one aboard the Skarn flagship had never been, touched with something that might have been simple gratitude. "I'd like that, Chancellor," she said. "I think we all would." She extended her hand, an old human gesture Nerameth had learned, for trust, an open palm, empty, holding nothing at all. Nerameth reached out with one of her own 4 hands and took it. Above them, the sky was finally fully clearing. The last fires had gone out days ago. And somewhere in the near distance, past the ruined coastline, the first new towers had already begun rising slowly out of the coral, toward a light no longer choked with smoke. The monsters had come to the Miranai homeworld expecting only to fight. They had left, weeks later, having chosen instead to be something else. Something the galaxy, for 400 years, had never once thought to ask them to be. Heroes.